All right, my young constitutional scholars, this is one of Taft's favorite things to talk about. It's also one of the most confusing things that happens in America's political system. People kind of question it inside the United States. People definitely question it outside the United States. And I love talking about it. And it's something that you probably don't have any clue about right now. But by the end of this and get into the bar exam, I think you'll know more than 99% of the population. That's pretty cool. And we're talking about the Electoral College. All right. Our target is that you can explain, apply, and evaluate the presidential election process. Basically, I want you to be able to make sense of the electoral process, the Electoral College, and then look at results of elections and tell me who won the election. If you have a question, I want you to post it on the Padlet. There's a link to it on my USM. As you go through this, and when you're done with this activity, with this video, there's some other things that you might want to play around with. But got any questions? Come up with them, post them, and we'll make sense of all this in class. You've got some notes. They're on some orange pieces of paper. It's 2 pages back and front. You're only going to deal with the first page and the first half of the second page. You're not going to deal with the very back. And also, it's a lot of fill in the blank. So it should move quickly with your writing, not a ton of writing you need to do. And then there's a ton of resources that you can take a look at if you want, some music you can listen to. And there's a game on iCivics that you might want to play. It's kind of fun. It's called Win the White House. But we're going to start here. Why do we have an electoral college? We know that the Electoral College was created in the Constitutional Convention of 1787. There they are, back in Philly. And we know that they did not want Congress eventually to elect the president because that would upset checks and balances. Congress would be above the president, and that wouldn't make sense when the branches were supposed to be somewhat equal. They also talked about having the state legislators elect the president, but that wasn't going to work either because the state legislators would then be above the president. The president would be beholden to the states, and that would mess with federalism. And then some people mentioned maybe having the people elect the president, but there was no way that was going to work in 1787. The country was too big, and the people just wouldn't know enough about a candidate that could represent the entire country as the executive. So they went with a system called electors. Our friend George Mason in the convention said that there's no way the people could elect. The extent of the country renders it impossible that the people can have the requisite capacity to judge the respective contentions of the candidates. In other words, the country was just too big. There's no way that people could understand it. So, if you think about it, now the country's smaller because of technology, because of social media and stuff like that. We know all about our candidates. Maybe we know too much about our candidates. So keep in the back of your mind, do we need the Electoral College still today? So what they did was they created the Electoral College in Article 2 of the Constitution. You read it in your Article 2 study guide. It's really short when you think about it. You didn't have to write much down about it, but there is one word that's in there a few times, majority. That's the key word here. So here is how the original Electoral College was going to work. Each of the states would have as many electors as senators and representatives of Congress, and those electors would be chosen in each state. So instead of people voting for president or vice president, they would vote for an elector or 2 or 3. If you have 1 representative and 2 senators, you would have 3 electors in your state. As you can see with the map, you can see that in 1789, some of the states actually didn't participate. North Carolina didn't. New York had just ratified. They didn't either. And obviously Rhode Island's not going to participate, well, because they're Rhode Island. But Pennsylvania had 10 electoral votes, which means they had 2 senators and 8 representatives in the House of Representatives. Each of those electors would cast 2 votes. They get to vote for 2 people. The person who would get the most electoral votes would be president, but only if the votes were a majority. They had to be more than half of the votes, a majority. I'm going to say it again, a majority, more than half. The person with the second highest amount of votes would be the vice president. Again, they'd have to have a majority. Okay? So again, people would choose electors. Electors get to cast 2 votes. Whoever gets the most votes, as long as it's more than half, is president. Whoever gets the second most votes is vice president. The electors would cast their 2 votes based as independent agents. All right. They would be independent agents based on their free will. There were no political parties back then. So a person who was an elector, if I chose like Joe Smith or Josephine Smith to be the elector that I wanted for my state or be one of them, they wouldn't vote for a Republican or a Democrat because there wasn't any. And they also wouldn't vote for somebody saying, vote for me, because when they made the Electoral College, people didn't run for office. It was actually sort of unmanly to run for office. The man didn't seek the office sought the man. And this original Electoral College worked fine. In the first one, every elector wrote down George Washington's name. Dude is unanimously elected president. John Adams got the second most votes. He's vice president. 1792 comes around. Every elector votes for George Washington again. He's president. John Adams gets the second most votes. He's vice president. They didn't even have a popular vote then. We don't even know like how many popular votes George Washington got. They didn't count them. This original Electoral College works fine until the third election. That third election is the election of 1796. And the thing that causes all of this to change is the development of political parties. By this time, 2 political parties had developed. So in the election of 1796, the electors were voted on in their states. People chose electors. All right. And remember, at this point, candidates are not running for president. They don't have like a vice presidential candidate either. It's just electors writing down people's names. And so in this election, John Adams, the Federalist candidate, got the most electoral votes, and it was a majority. So he was elected president, but he's in a party called the Federalist. Thomas Jefferson is in the new party called the Democratic Republican Party. In fact, he's kind of like the poster boy for the Democratic Republican Party. He gets the second most electoral votes, just a few shy of John Adams. He becomes the vice president. So John Adams, the Federalist, is president. Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republican, is the vice president. That would be like President Biden, Vice President Trump. Not going to work out too well. In fact, it was so divisive that Thomas Jefferson didn't do anything as vice president. He didn't even live in Washington, D.C., to my knowledge. Fast forward to 4 years, and this is where everything breaks. The election of 1800. This is when things get a little nutty. By this time, political parties are now nominating candidates. They're naming who they want for president and who they want for vice president. And the electors, and you can see from the map, most of the electors, over half, are going to vote for Thomas Jefferson for president from the Democratic Republican Party. The thing is, though, every elector got 2 votes, remember? And so Thomas Jefferson, every Democratic Republican elector voted for Thomas Jefferson, but every Democratic Republican elector also voted for Aaron Burr. So there were 73 people who were Democratic Republican, who were electors. They all voted for Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. So those guys are going to tie. All right. How do you break this tie? Well, it's almost impossible to break this tie because every state's going to get 1 vote, and the states couldn't decide in the House of Representatives. Every state's going to get 1 vote, and the states couldn't decide. They couldn't decide. They voted. They voted 35 times until Alexander Hamilton cast his vote. He changed his vote and supported Thomas Jefferson, which is kind of interesting because Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton didn't see eye to eye. In fact, they started, not they, but the first 2 political parties started around them. Hamilton didn't agree with Jefferson in anything, but Hamilton didn't like Aaron Burr. And so Thomas Jefferson became president, Aaron Burr became vice president, and there's some songs written about it. Jefferson, you have my vote. And then Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr a few years later got into a duel. Aaron Burr shot Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton died, and they wrote an entire musical about it. Good times. Good times. So, how did the original Electoral College change? Well, it's all because of parties. A couple ways is after the election of 1800, political parties will always nominate someone for president and vice president. All right, nominate means to name. So they're going to say, here's who we want to have as our president. There's a couple little deviations in there, but in general, kind of like we have right now, the parties nominate people for president and vice president. The second change is that electors are no longer going to vote on their free will. Basically, I'm not voting for Joe Smith, the elector, because I think he's a smart dude. I'm voting for Joe Smith, the elector, because I know that Joe Smith is going to vote for a Republican or a Federalist back then, now a Republican or a Democrat. The only other change was a constitutional change, and they had to make this change. That change is with the 12th Amendment, one of the first two amendments after the Bill of Rights, which says that electors now don't get two votes. Electors actually get one vote for president and one vote for vice president. They have to name them separately. They don't have two votes for president. They have one for president and one for vice president. They have to name them separately. That's how it works now. That's how it happened back in the day. Let's fast forward. In the Electoral College today in 2023, or the 2024 map that you see there, it's the setup is still pretty much similar. Every state has the same number of electoral votes as it has members of Congress, whatever the number is for their House of Representatives, and 2 for the Senate. So it's based on population, but to get to the number, it's however many people they have in the House plus 2 in the Senate. It's their number in Congress. Wisconsin has 8 people in the House of Representatives. We have 2 people in the Senate. That is 10 electoral votes. We are voting for 10 electors. Electors are chosen by the political parties. There are 10 people that are Democratic electors. There are 10 people that are Republican electors. There are 10 people that are Socialist electors. There are 10 people that are Green Party electors in the state of Wisconsin. Those electors are pledged to vote for the candidate of that party. Voters in each state will vote for the candidate. So this is what the ballot kind of looked like in 2020. However, if I'm going and voting for Joe Biden, voting for Joe Biden, technically I'm voting for 10 electors to vote for Joe Biden. If I'm voting for Donald Trump, technically I'm voting for 10 electors to vote for Donald Trump. And of course, if I'm voting for Brian Carroll and Amar Patel, technically I'm voting for 10 electors to vote for Brian Carroll and Amar Patel. These are the electors. These were the electors in 2020. You can see the list on the left and the list on the right. All right. They had met on October 6th. Those were the people that were technically being voted for. If I voted for these electors on the left side, the Democratic Party, I'm saying I want Joe Biden to be president, Kamala Harris to be vice president, because these 10 electors are pledged to vote for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. If I want Donald Trump to be president, technically I'm voting for these 10 electors over here on the right, because they are pledged to vote for Donald Trump and Mike Pence. Now, how do we figure out who gets the electoral votes? Well, actually, whichever candidate gets the most popular votes, whichever candidate in Wisconsin, the people vote, gets the most votes from the people, they win the electoral votes. It's like they win like 10 points almost. All right. So if you win the most votes from the people, you get all of the state's electoral votes. That's called winners take all. That happens in every state but 2, and I'll explain that in class. So if I win the popular vote in Wisconsin for president, I get all 10 electoral votes, meaning all 10 electors from Wisconsin are going to vote for me. So if this was the case, who would win the electoral votes in Wisconsin if this happened? And this happened in 2016. You'll notice it's quite close. You'll notice that's less than a percentage apart. In fact, it's about 23,000 people apart. But Donald Trump would get all of those electoral votes. And that's what happened in 2016. To win the presidency, how does that happen? Well, to win the presidency, a candidate must win a majority of the electoral votes. They count up all of the electoral votes in each state. It happens on the same night. They count them up. They count up the popular votes. Those determine the electoral votes. And then it's a race to get to the majority of the electoral votes. There are 538 total electoral votes because of the members of Congress. There are 535 members of Congress, and Washington, D.C. gets 3 electoral votes because of a change to the Constitution, an amendment, because so many people lived in Washington, D.C., but because they couldn't vote for president because they're not a state, people felt like it was undemocratic. So there are 538 electoral votes. A majority of 538 is 270 electoral votes. So it's the first to 270 electoral votes. It's kind of like a competition where you're trying to score points, and there are 538 points out there. Whoever gets to 270, they're going to win. So in this case, if you take a look, Donald Trump, if he won 6 million popular votes in the state or in the country, Biden won 3.5 million popular votes, and the third guy got 500,000. That doesn't matter. What matters is the electoral vote. As you can see, Donald Trump won 400 electoral votes, which is a majority of the electoral votes. So Donald Trump would win that election and be president. In this case, excuse me, you'll see that Joe Biden won the most popular votes, but again, that doesn't matter. We've got to go over here to the electoral votes. Joe Biden won 300 electoral votes, which is a majority. He didn't win a majority of the popular vote, but he won a majority of the electoral vote. So he would win the presidency there because he got a majority of the electoral votes. Say that out loud right now. Majority of the electoral votes. Even in this one, Donald Trump wins the most popular votes, but he doesn't get a majority of the electoral votes. In fact, the third gal guy gets a majority of the electoral votes, even though Donald Trump got more popular votes. So the third gal guy is going to win because they got a majority of the electoral votes. And then there's something like this. In this case, you can see that the third gal guy got the most popular votes. But nobody over here got a majority of the electoral votes. Joe Biden won some states. Donald Trump won some states and got some electoral votes. Nobody got more than half. So no one wins because no one has, say it out loud, a majority of the electoral votes. So what happens? If no one gets a majority, the top 3 names for president go to the House of Representatives. These 3 names would go to the House of Representatives, and each state would get 1 vote. Who knows how they would vote? It's up to each state. And then the top 2 names for vice president would go to the Senate, and each state would get 1 vote. This has not happened in a long time. It happened in 1800, and it happened in 1824. It hasn't gone to the House of Representatives since then. The actual voting happens when the electors go to their state capitals on the second Wednesday in December, and they go and they cast their vote. We kind of know who they're voting for, we think, but on the second Wednesday in December, those electors go and they cast their votes, and they get sent to Washington, D.C. And the votes in Washington, D.C. are counted on January 6th. And then the president is inaugurated on January 20th. Now, that January 6th date used to mean nothing to your average American until January 6th, 2021. And we'll talk about that in class in our next meeting. So we're going to stop right there. If you have any questions or scenarios you want to know about, pop them on that Padlet. It's on MyUSM. If you have any interest in learning more, there's tons of resources, as I said. But we're going to spend the better part of the class, our next class, learning about the Electoral College and trying to make sense of this. Sound good? All right. We'll see you later. American History Rules. I hope you're enjoying this. I hope you're preparing for the bar exam. Go History.